A number of the sessions that you see today and also in the upcoming days of the OECD are very much focused on purchasing practices and or due diligence. One of the building blocks for more sustainability, of course, is changing the power relationship between buyers and suppliers and ensuring that there really is room for responsible purchasing practices. Getting there does require joint efforts and joint responsibility. You will have to bring in the leadership teams, commercial teams, CSR departments, of course, and of course, the partners in the supply chain and along the full supply chain. Two outstanding efforts that guide that work are the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices and the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative, STTI, with their white paper. STTI is a group of manufacturers that came together during the pandemic and said, no more, this is not how we can do it. We cannot run socially, environmentally, and economically viable business under these conditions. So here's a definition of commercial compliance that we recommend for purchasing practices, and that basically resulted in the so-called white paper. So that's a unique global manufacturer-driven initiative focused on creating fairer purchasing practices. But of course, that's only one out of two. The other one is the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, which serves as a reference point for companies working to improve their purchasing practices and for the respective multi-stakeholder initiatives who want to give some guidance to their members on how to improve purchasing practices so that working conditions can be improved in the long run. This benchmark, the Common Framework, consists of 5 principles that, similarly to the white papers, state what we're thriving for in the sector. Luckily, if you look at both of them, you can see that there's quite a big overlap. So I think we have already made some few strides in the industry together. But what we want to discuss today is how can companies integrate responsible purchasing practices into their businesses. Instead of introducing our panelists today in too much detail, I would like to let you to get to know them through their daily work and the thoughts they have on purchasing practices. So I feel we should maybe get started with Vanessa, if that's okay for you. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning.
Good
afternoon,
morning.
Evening.
The sustainability conversation often feels like we are discussing parts of the puzzle only. And I think more and more now we're seeing that we look more at the bigger questions, like how do we do businesses? What's the business model behind that? And purchasing practices is very much at the heart of that. Vanessa, you're a responsible purchasing practices expert and the founder of Portmore Consulting, and you've worked with sourcing and buying departments intensively. If we focus on that perspective first, sort of that internal perspective, and if you can take 2 minutes, what is it that you've seen? What have you experienced in buying departments that you would like to share with us?
Thank you, Lisa. I think the big picture that's happening now is that businesses are realizing that that traditional siloed approach, we might call it, just isn't working. It isn't working from a human rights point of view, but honestly, I would argue it's not working from a business point of view either. And so they are starting to look towards responsible purchasing practices as one of the tools that can help them figure out what's going on in their business. And why would they do that? Well, honestly, from my point of view, I believe that you get overall better business outcomes when you start to think in this way. So better sourcing, better buying. It's not just about human rights. For example, let me give you a quick example. If you start to forecast better, you get not only a factory who's better able to plan their labor needs, they do less illegal subcontracting, they've got less excessive overtime, but guess what? You also get better on-time deliveries as well. Marvelous. You get huge benefits internally when you start to think about that siloed approach. You think about the end-to-end value chain and your teams start to understand themselves, each other far better and work towards a shared goal. And from my own experience of working in supply chains, I know that great supplier partnerships result in way more benefits than anybody anticipated at the start. All sorts of things start to flow. So figuring out who the good guys are in your supply chain, figuring out how to work with them in a much more proactive sense, hearing from them what's needed in our organizations, helping us to figure out the improvements that we need to make. All of that honestly can be a revelation when you start to get into it. It's like we take the suppliers out of their silo and give them a voice to be part of the work.
Thank you for sharing that. If you say you base your improvements on stronger relationship with buyers, the buyers with their suppliers, that sounds always great on paper, and it's not a new argument that we hear. But what are some of the challenges you feel that the buying departments and the buying companies in general face in order to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and there are a lot of challenges. I think the three main ones for me would be the first one is understanding yourself, understanding your internal processes. It's always a surprise when you start to assess what goes on inside your own business, when you look at how the category teams, they all work differently, going on between design, PD, tech, how all those handoffs work between the teams. Everybody is surprised when they go through that exercise to discover stuff they didn't know about themselves. So you have to do that mapping first. You have to understand your internal challenges before you can then start to understand how that impacts externally on the lives of your suppliers and arguably the workers in their businesses. So that's the first one, your internal impact. The second one is the nature of those supplier relationships, because honestly, I'm absolutely sure everybody here thinks that they have great knowledge of their suppliers. They understand lots of details about their suppliers. But my question is that really the same thing as having a really grown-up conversation about what makes everybody's business successful? Do we know how he makes money? Do we actually have that question out in the open? Do we know what margins he needs? He needs a margin because we want him to invest in the right labor, the right skills, maybe some plant in infrastructure, machinery. There's all sorts of stuff that he needs to do. So we have to have that conversation. Now, at the start of the conversation, it's quite hard. In fact, I would argue it's very hard because there is this, in our traditional model, in the way we work now, there is this inherent power imbalance. We hold all the cards as the buyers. So at the beginning, when you start to have this conversation, you have to think really hard about how you get into this. You really have to lay the ground for a long journey. This is about having a long-term relationship, a proper, meaningful commitment to this supplier about how things work so that they can start to make some improvements. So think about how you do that carefully. And then my third point would be the leadership team. Their engagement and support. It's a huge challenge in some businesses. And honestly, we could have a whole separate conversation about leadership teams and how we engage them. But I think the short story for me is we have to make sure that we, within the commercial teams and the corporate responsibility teams, it's our job to make sure that the leadership teams understand the links between business practice and the impact and risk in their supply chain. Make sure they can see this stuff, because sometimes they can't. They're not in the detail in the same way that we are. Help them understand those links and make it clear that we're not here to break the business model. We're not here to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we say in English. Apologies for that. We don't want to suddenly make everything cost a load more, but honestly, arguably, you get to a better business place when you start to do this.
Thank you for sharing, Vanessa. If you allow me to paraphrase here, there were basically, sort of three recommendations that you've made when it comes to the challenges. One was understand your internal processes better, really look at the nature of the relationships with your suppliers and, honest and in a frank way. Mm-hmm. And then third, if you want to look at the roots, you also need to make the connection between sustainability conversation and business, including, the role that leadership plays in that. So thank you very much for sharing that. I already have one more question for you that I wrote down, but I'll switch to one of our other speakers for now. I'll come back to you later. Arnoud, I would like to also thank you for being here today. as a CSR manager of Zeeman, you have what some might call maybe the superpower, and that's that you were actually with the buying departments before. So you're now the CSR manager, but you do speak sort of both languages, if you want to put it that way. And I'm sure that's really contributing to the conversation that you have at Zeeman too. So I want to ask you two-folded question. One, looking first at which steps have you taken internally to integrate responsible purchasing practices into your business practices at Zeeman? And then as a second part, and we'll come back to that, how do the challenges you see differ or confirm what Vanessa was saying? So if we can take about, I don't know, let's say 2 minutes for each of one, start with what you've been practically doing right now. I'd be curious to see if you could share a bit more about that.
Yes, of course. My name is Arnold van Vliet. I'm a CSR manager for almost 12 years at Zeeman. I'm not here to tell you how you should work on responsible purchasing practices, but I'd like to, of course, share our journey with you. So a few years ago, we started to send out an anonymous survey to our suppliers. And we asked them 27 questions. It's comparable to the questionnaire of Better Buying. And we really received very valuable feedback of our suppliers. So that was the start of our buying practice two-pager, which we created based on the input of the suppliers we received from this survey. And during that same time, we became a member of the Fair Wear Foundation. And they also have a very strong idea of how a brand or retailer should work with its suppliers. So with this input, we created these two-pagers and we shared it with our buying teams. Also, we organized two workshops together with the Fair Wear Foundation. So that was an initial start to work on responsible purchasing practices. And last year we have developed a two-way code of conduct. We already had our traditional code of conduct, which is setting out very clear the workers' rights a factory has to comply with. But one of the biggest challenges is, as Vanessa was already sharing, the power imbalance that's there between a buyer and supplier. So by creating a two-way code of conduct and implement this buying practice two-pager into this code of conduct, we hope to create a two-way street. So for a supplier, it's clear what they can expect from Zeeman, and vice versa. So that's how we approach this. Of course, there are many challenges coming from this. One of the comments from suppliers we received, and we also embedded in this two-way code of conduct, is that they would expect from us as a brand to create better forecasting, so they know what kind of quantities to expect. And as a family-owned company, we always strive for long-term partnerships. This is really helpful in many ways, but still we are not able to give them a proper forecasting. They know from the history what kind of quantities to expect, but we don't give them a commitment towards the future. We also don't have the systems for this. So we are looking now into ways how we can embed this in our working ways. Internally, how we try to also align this with our buyers is that prior to the start of the buying season and buyers go out to place their orders, we have a 1 or 2 hour meeting in which we go through the suppliers they work with, and we look at the corrective action plans that came out from the social audits. We look at the quality level based on the complaints we received during the past year. So we looked at the grievances we received from the grievance mechanism of Fair Wear. We give them input from the trainings Fairware did at Supplier. So in this way, we want to share the CSR agenda with our buyers prior to them making any buying decisions. So and this we do now for 2 years, and it's really helpful that also when the buyer visits a supplier or has a VC call during COVID, that we speak with the same voice. So that CSR and buying speak with the same voice. I think that's beneficial, and so far it worked out well. It's for us as a CSR team also very nice if a buyer wants to address some urgent issues that came out from social audits, for example. So this is what I can share in 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing some practical examples. And I thought it was nice to hear that, while you call it, speaking with one voice, really complemented what Vanessa was saying. You both departments need to be in line. You need to have that conversations internally going as well. And that seems to be successful for you. And I also thought it was interesting that you mentioned that one of the topics you're working on more is forecasting. Forecasting is one thing that both the suppliers have pressed for in the STTI white paper, saying, this could make our life so much easier. And it's also one of the part of one of the principles under the common framework. So seeing that, we're not having parallel conversations, but we're having sort of the same conversation in all spheres is something that I find very encouraging. So thank you for sharing that, Arnoud. Okay. Fatima, let me also bring you into the conversation. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. You're the General Manager of AMETH, the Moroccan Association of Textile and Clothing. And AMETH is, among some other associations, one of the members of the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative. And STTI really got started during COVID times. And I think the assumption that some people made was, well, yeah, but now is kind of a low for purchasing practices. It's COVID times. We're in unheard of waters. And then the hope, I guess, was that we would see major improvements after that. But if you look at what was the situation like when STTI was founded, and what is the situation that you face in Morocco like right now?
Well, Lisa, it's a good thing that we could today have this kind of discussions between buyers and suppliers. And that's probably one of the few good outcomes of COVID, is that it unveiled some practices that were definitely unfair. And we were hoping at that time, by putting together initiatives like STTI, the Common Framework, and so on, that we would get an improvement in the purchasing practices. But the reality is that we thought we did hit rock bottom during COVID, and that things could only get better as we go along. But the reality is that it's as bad, if not worse, than it was during COVID. And if we look at the case of Morocco or other countries, because STTI, like you mentioned earlier, is a group of manufacturers from several countries that represent the huge bulk of garment and textile production in the world, the feeling is shared by everyone. So it's a global feeling from suppliers that, like Vanessa mentioned earlier, there is a strong power imbalance between buyers and suppliers, and it feels like buyers are actually using the current situation to put more pressure on the suppliers at the end of the value chain. So what we've been seeing in terms of practices is, well, zero forecasting. Orders have been flowing in a completely disorganized way, where you could have periods where you have so much order, you don't know how to produce them because it's too much. And then out of the blue, probably even the next week, you don't have any orders. So it makes it very difficult, like it was mentioned earlier, for factories to plan production, plan workers, dispatch work among workers, and so on. So that's one phenomenon that we've been seeing. The other one is the pressure on prices. Vanessa mentioned earlier margins. What is the proper margin that would allow these suppliers to be running in a viable business environment? I think the feeling we have today as suppliers is that the buyers don't care. All that matters to them is their own margin. Okay, we have to admit that COVID put a lot of pressure on everyone, buyers included, because there's price competition among the different brands and retailers, because there's a pressure from consumers, because demand from consumers is going down, and so on. But we feel that the buyers took the easy way out, in the sense that when you look at the figures they publish, they're all publishing positive results at the end of the year. But if you go look at what's happening in the factories, it's not good. And recently, there was a study from Aberdeen University about buying or purchasing practices in Bangladesh. And let me quote some of the findings, the key findings from that study. It says basically that 51% of the factories that were surveyed, we're talking about 1,000 companies, factories that were surveyed in this study, 51% of them are reporting at least one, if not more, unfair purchasing practices. That includes cancellation of orders. That includes price pressure, price reduction. The fact that some brands and retailers simply refuse to pay the orders or ask for reduction in the prices that were initially agreed, and they also delayed payments. And we also have a key finding that I think is important, is that these unfair practices are more common among big brands and retailers than smaller ones. So these brands and retailers are actually work with a huge number of factories and are somehow responsible for the well-being of dozens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers, are the ones that are actually having the worst purchasing practices. And in some cases, they're even paying below cost of production. They can't pretend they don't know what's going on. They can't pretend they don't know the impact of their unfair practices on the workers in the factories. And that's something that we need to talk about, and that's something that we need to work all together in order to resolve and change the current business model in a more sustainable one.
Thank you for sharing, Fatima. That was very interesting. And I think the Aberdeen study is great proof that the situation has, not drastically improved. And if you look at, paying prices below production cost and having such huge changes in orders, may that be due to like shops closing during COVID, then you had logistical problems during the pandemic, then it's also the recession on consumer demand changing or going down. If you look at that situation where you say, okay, the situation right now is really dire, but this is not a conversation that can wait until we're sort of in nicer times again. Are there any quick wins or recommendations or beneficial factors to an environment where you say, okay, in that environment, we could be having these conversations? Because Arnold, for example, was saying, we also appreciate it if our if our suppliers raise these issues and, make proactive contributions of like, this is something that would be helpful for us, that really would need to change. So are there any quick wins or the added value factors to the environment where you feel that would be possible?
Well, I think that would be possible if we manage somehow altogether to create a safe environment where suppliers can actually communicate with the buyers. I mean, what Arnold just mentioned is, I'm not going to say one of a kind, but not enough of a kind of what is actually happening, because we all mentioned earlier the imbalance of power between the buyers and the suppliers. The suppliers are afraid that if they voice their concerns, it's gonna get back to them. They might lose orders, this kind of things. So there is a fear today to voice the concerns that the suppliers actually have. So basically, we need to create a safe environment. And I think the key words here are, first of all, the trust. We need to build a partnership built on trust, where buyers can trust the suppliers and suppliers can trust their buyers. Communication. I mean, Arnold mentioned earlier that they sent out an anonymous survey to the suppliers to have their feedback. How many brands and retailers actually do that? I don't know any of them. So that could be a good start. But you need to guarantee to your suppliers that there won't be any retaliation afterwards. I mean, we've seen it with STTI and so on. We send out surveys to the members. How many of them actually felt comfortable enough to answer? They're all worried. And forecasting, we talked about it earlier. That's something easy to put in place to allow the suppliers to better plan their production, the human resources, the cost, and so on. That's very important. And definitely we need to stop producing below cost or expecting the suppliers to produce below cost, because what happens today on the ground is that the buyers are actually playing suppliers against each other in order to get the lowest price. Given the current situation where orders are scarce, limited, guess what? Everybody's going to try to quote the lowest price in order to get the order, at least to get some orders in the production chain. And what happens is that, well, you're not able to pay minimum wage anymore because whatever price you're quoting is not enough. So the final impact is going to be definitely on the workers at the end of the supply chain. So I think, just to sum up, that today what we need to put in place very quickly is a safe environment where there is communication between buyers and suppliers, and the commitment on the buyer side that whatever feedback they have from the suppliers, they will take it into consideration and work together in implementing or correcting these unfair practices in a constructive and positive way, because basically the well-being of the suppliers is what's going to contribute to the well-being of the buyers. The current business model is not sustainable over time. At some point, you will end up, if you keep going like this, you'll end up with suppliers closing down one after the other, and then the retailers and the brands won't have any more suppliers to buy from. So they need to be aware that they need to work with the suppliers to create a better working environment in order for them to benefit from it.
Yeah, Fatima, I think you really raised the paradox here. Basically, if your efforts in trying to raise concerns and contributing to improving that relationship result you in losing that relationship, because you bringing forward concerns or making suggestions of what needed to be improved in order to run a socially, environmentally, and economically viable business, result you in not having that client anymore, then we're really not making any progress. So that environment needs to drastically change. And I think one of the ways to do that is how STTI and the Common Framework try to contribute to that. Vanessa, I mentioned that I would come back to you with one question. So now is your time. Having listened to Fatima and Arnaud and giving your own experiences, I would like to ask you, if we're moving away from how things are now and knowing that how they should be or how we will be doing things according to Vanessa Portmore, is there like a best practice or a vision forward that you can share with us?
Nice, simple question. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, what I want to do is start by telling you the upside. I want to talk to the commercial people as well as the CR people here. The upside of doing things differently. I want to reflect on a time in my life about 1,000 years ago when I was a buyer or sourcing manager, and I walked into one of my main factory suppliers, really key guy, with my boss, who was the chief supply chain officer in this big corporate I worked in. My boss totally got it. My boss said, "Your deliveries suck. They have been terrible for years. And for years, we have been fining you because of your poor deliveries. Okay, today we're going to stop fining you. And I want you to," and he pointed at me and the factory manager, "and I want you to figure out what's going on." And that led to a whole different way of working, a whole different conversation. And the key one that came out of it was, interestingly, Arno and Fatima, was the point about forecasting. Making sure we understood his capacity, making sure we understood the peaks and troughs, and getting us to a much better place in terms of how we forecast into him. He used to employ every year randomly loads of casual labor to meet those crazy peaks that Fatima was talking about. You know, suddenly there was this peak of production and then suddenly it would crash. During those periods, he spent a lot of money on that labor force. His efficiencies dropped and his quality went absolutely into the bin. And suddenly he didn't have to do that. And it was almost like we turned on a light switch. It literally happened in the first year where he no longer had to do that. And the other benefits that flowed from that were absolutely incredible. We had far better quality of product, and over the coming years, that quality increased and increased. He saved all sorts of money because of that craziness that he used to have to do and now didn't have to do, which allowed us a couple of years later to go into a conversation about living wages, which he actually achieved a couple of years later. And even more exciting, he then passed on these disciplines down into his supply chain, because, to Fatima's point about the long-term sustainability of our businesses and our supply chains, there is a business issue here about how we are going to sustain our businesses in the longer term. And this is a conversation that the leadership teams like to hear as well. So back to my vision, Lisa. Sorry, that was a bit longer than you probably wanted. My vision, a time when our value chain partners, let's think of them like that, are at the heart of our community. They are part of that people piece that we all have in our businesses. Every business I work with has a product, people, planet thing going on. The people piece, the community piece, let's actually put the suppliers in the heart of that, our value chains, make sure they're part of that, so that there comes a time when we have better deliveries, better quality, probably in some cases lower costs. Honestly, that can happen. And we all of us can look ourselves in the mirror in the morning and know that the workers who make our stuff are respected, safe, and being properly paid. A great vision.
There you
I
go. Thank you for sharing that. I absolutely don't regretting asking for your vision. That was very up spirit. I like that. I think I can both professionally and personally definitely share that. I also like that it was a practical example, and I think this is also something I'd like to keep looking at for the rest of the webinar. So for that, on that note, I would like to invite our expert, Elisa Shepherd, to join us from ETI. Elisa is the Senior Advisor for Business Practices at ETI and will give us some more information about the learning and implementation communities, which are an integral part of the common framework. So Elisa, floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and great panel. Thanks, everyone. So my name is Elisa Shepherd. I'm Senior Advisor for Business Practices at the Ethical Trading Initiative, and I'm going to be talking about the Responsible Purchasing Practices Learning and Implementation Community. There we go. I've got some slides coming up. It's run by representatives of the MSI Working Group on Responsible Purchasing Practices, joined by Solidaridad, and facilitated by supply chain and purchasing practices expert Hilary Murdoch. So the aim of the community is to support brands to make positive changes to their purchasing practices. We have about 35 brands on board. The initiative launched last October, and it's running for a period of 2 years, through which time we're running 12 large workshops with input from a range of stakeholders. We're providing resources and additional support for the brands. As we already started in October, we're not inviting new members to join at this point, but we are making resources public to support other companies on their journey. So do check out our website. I believe somebody's added it into the chat to access some of those resources. So to get started, it's worth briefly illustrating the typical dynamic that we see, which has been highlighted through the panel discussion, which is that the responsible sourcing teams and the commercial teams tend to function quite separately to one another, and that labour standards very much sit within the remit of the responsible sourcing team. And so on the whole, there is very little knowledge within the commercial teams of the impact that purchasing practices can have on suppliers and workers. So we end up with these intense commercial pressures that buyers are very much faced with on a day-to-day, that come through in purchasing practices and place immense pressure on suppliers and undermine their ability to meet the labour standards that the same brand itself is advocating for. So suppliers are very much exposed to these conflicting pressures from different departments of the same brand. So through our work with the learning and implementation community, one of the most important aspects is getting all of these stakeholders to be communicating. It's to connect the commercial and the responsible sourcing teams to work together with supply chain partners on developing more collaborative ways of working that improve purchasing practices. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this diagram shows the process that we're working through with our community of brands. We've got this initial internal engagement and a team who come together to develop their understanding of the current purchasing practices. They map this against feedback from their supplier to undertake an initial risk assessment, which enables them to prioritize where they need to take action. We want them to be trialing out some changes and then ultimately implementing these at scale. And you can see this collaborative approach with suppliers needs to be ongoing throughout. So exploring these in a bit more depth, firstly, as a requirement of joining the community, we asked brands to nominate a person from their commercial team and a person from their responsible sourcing team to attend the workshops and work together on the activities. And for so many brands, this in itself has been a huge obstacle. Many brands have found it really hard to get a person from the commercial side of the business to take part in working on something that is perceived as a responsible sourcing issue. And it's clear that the leadership teams have a really big role to play in actually making this happen. So the brands that have been really successful and have been able to get stuck in and making progress are the ones who have successfully got their leadership teams on board, and in turn are being supported with the practicalities of resourcing and prioritizing this work. So from this initial internal engagement, we really encourage brands to identify champions within the company. And this is people who really get it, who are able to club together and figure out how they can get that wider engagement within the organization. So one of the activities that we have asked brands to do for their own use is to sit down with different departments of the organization, ideally in a workshop environment, and to map their procurement cycle. Not just the protocol and the policies, but to be really honest with each other about what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis. And if they are being honest, and if they are digging deep enough, there's some really insightful stuff that comes out of this process. So it might be that brands have a code of conduct in place that covers commercial transactions, but dig a bit deeper and you start to hear that the buyers aren't actually sure where to find it, and it's not something that's being referred to by department heads. So whilst there may be some good protocols in place, you start to realize that they are not being socialized across other departments. And you can really start to see that there are some differences of perspective of how things work. And the feedback that we've had from brands is that this has been a really invaluable exercise to start building this more holistic understanding of what's happening within the business. And this mapping the procurement cycle is one of the resources that we have saved on our website. So it's now available for others to download. So yeah, do head over there and have a look. Supplier feedback. Right, purchasing practices are problematic when they are negatively impacting supply chain partners, and businesses can't possibly build an accurate picture of this impact without asking the supplier. So creating this feedback loop is essential, and there's various ways to do this. Some brands, as we've just heard, have had great success with surveys. I'm sure you can imagine they are more insightful when they are anonymous. So third-party or generally anonymous surveys are a good way to go. But another good way to get feedback is to just ask. I think that some of the companies that we have been working with have felt quite paralyzed by the idea that they need a big organized survey. And there are definitely advantages to surveys. But as we've heard from Vanessa in the panel, actually picking up the phone and building those one-to-one relationships and making time to really listen about what a brand could be doing better is one of the most fundamental and important steps. There is a power dynamic at play, but we have heard from many suppliers who are willing to open up and are willing to speak about the impact of purchasing practices. So it is definitely something that needs to be happening alongside other activities. So when brands pull all of this information together and they pair up their supplier feedback with other information from their human rights due diligence, like worker voice, engagement with trade unions, or complaints that have been coming through, and they map these against this more holistic understanding of what is happening within the brand, they can start to get an idea of the risk and impact of their purchasing practices. And we've just released another tool on our website which can facilitate this process and help companies to be mapping their findings. So once brands have this initial risk assessment, they can start to have the information that they need to be brainstorming some solutions and trialing some changes. And I cannot stress enough the importance of doing this together with supply chain partners and in cross-functional teams. The aim is to develop systems that work better for everyone, and that can only be done if everyone has the chance to input and to help shape them. So the ideas that work will need to be implemented at scale and then really embedded into the organization. And then the cycle starts again, a continuous approach to collating feedback, working collaboratively to make improvements. So the tool that we use to guide this work is the Common Framework. It's split into 5 overarching principles, which are integration, making this happen internally, training, KPIs, equal partnership, which is about good communication and problem solving, collaborative planning, which looks at lead times and production planning, fair payment terms, and sustainable costing. And the framework was created through an extensive benchmark of documents that already exist on purchasing practices and with a wide stakeholder consultation to amend it. As mentioned before, a particular influence was the SCTI white paper, which was constructed by manufacturers. And we are really pleased to hear then to start receiving feedback that companies and training consultants are already using this document as a reference document. So please do go and have a look for it. And if you have any questions, you can contact us via that web address that you can see there, via that email address. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. I already saw that we have a few questions coming in, both towards you, but also towards our earlier panelists. I think you very clearly showed that the learning and implementation communities address that sort of integral part of communication and joint learning between suppliers and buyers, but also within the buying companies, just across departments. And that you've also highlighted the different modes of engagement. You know, sometimes it might be the one-on-one engagement, sometimes it's a bigger survey, sometimes it's anonymous feedback, and sometimes it's more working with a supplier who's maybe not your individual client, but who can give you, you know, some general understandings on what impacts that has. So I think if it's very important for you to see that all the stakeholders are considered in that, and like that includes the leadership, the departments within the buying company, and the suppliers, of course. I've already received a number of questions, so I'd like to get started on those. One follow-up question to Arno, what you were saying earlier was for the two-way code of conduct and your two-pager on buying practices. One question was, is it available publicly? And then also, you came up with these based on feedback. Did you also collect, like in a second step, feedback on how they were perceived, or like it's basically your solution puzzle piece at this point? Does that also, was that received well? Did that already relate to any improvements? Was there a second feedback loop? How did that work after you put them out there?
A good question. The input from the survey we have included in the buying practices, and at the end it resulted in one document, a two-way code of conduct. And this, of course, is a work in progress. If you ask us, it all starts with setting out a clear guideline or policy. So all parties in your value chain know what is expected from them and what they can expect from us as a brand retailer. So that's set out on paper, and we now work together with the buyers continuously on the improvement. Another topic I didn't mention was to gain more insight in the costing of items. So to work on open costing. We do this with the help of the new Fair Price app of Fairware. And based on the outcome of these open costing calculations, we also look if these cost prices that result after doing this exercise in the Fair Price app allow also decent wages are being paid. So it's all intertwined, all the topics that touch upon human rights with, for example, with open costing.
Thank you. Then I have a question to Fatima. What common tool do big brands and suppliers use to, or should be using, to have a clue on the supplier's burden? What's something that you feel like you've encountered in sort of like common feedback loops, or are there no common tools at the moment?
Well, Arno just mentioned the open cost way of working with the buyers. We do have few buyers, for example, in Morocco, few brands and retailers in Morocco that work with open costs. So they come to you and tell you, okay, I want this item, how much is it gonna cost? And then you go through all the details, all the various steps of the production in order to end up with the final actual cost, including a fair margin to the buyer, to the supplier. That's a good way of doing it. For me, it's difficult to replicate in all the brands and retailers because the reality is that the buyers are not trained to do that. So I think that's something that should be put in place within the companies internally to train these young buyers, because we see a big turnover as well in the brands and the retailers. We see new faces all the time, and they're not familiar with that kind of things. All that matters to them is to go up to their hierarchy and say, okay, I got this at the best price possible. So I think there is also a need to train within the companies, the buyers and the retailers, to train the buyers on open cost, on how to actually cost an item. And that's something that is also missing.
Thank you. Then we have one question to Vanessa. What would be your top 3 recommendations or first actions to the sustainability department to successfully get the organization to understand the urgency behind working on purchasing practices?
Okay, well, at the risk of sounding like a cracked record, I honestly think that cross-functional mapping exercise is the biggest starting unlock, because everybody has different measures in their job descriptions. Everybody is aiming for a different goal at this point. And it's only when you start to lay out what's really going on in your business and dig through it in that, as Elisa mentioned, that it has to be the commercial people, the category people, the responsible sourcing people, everybody together in a room. You have so many aha moments when everybody suddenly realizes how their job impacts on somebody else's job and how that potentially could impact in the supply chain. So you absolutely have to start there. And so that's one. I think coming out of that comes a piece around those job descriptions and measures and how we reward people. That becomes a conversation that has to go up to the leadership team. And the other thing is starting on the journey with the supplier feedback and figuring out, are you going to do something like better buying, like Arnaud was telling us about the Zeeman approach, you know, sending out their survey. There are a few places now we can find out some surveys, doing an anonymous survey to make sure you get as far as you can honest feedback. When you send the survey out, my big advice is make sure it goes with the support of the leadership team. Make sure the leadership team, you know, so if you're in the CR department and you're proposing, or sorry, the responsible sourcing department, and you're proposing to go and do a supplier survey, if you send it out on your own with nobody else being connected to it from the commercial team and the leadership team, it isn't going to be responded to in the same way. It won't be understood in the same way. Getting the leadership team to back it, as it were, to be there as part of that process is really important. Does that help?
Thank you, Vanessa. I think that was some quite practical tips. Then I also have a question to Elisa from Paul Roland. Will the MSIs that are part of the common framework or the learning and implementation communities require their members, like the members of the respective MSIs, be expected to adhere to the common framework, and how could it be made visible which of the brands are sort of putting what they do in the learning and implementation communities and the common framework in general, like visibly into practice, so that you also know what stands behind the common framework in terms of following action?
So we believe purchasing practices is a really important issue, and our organizations are actively lobbying for legislation on purchasing practices. We are advocating for purchasing practices to be included in the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and having conversations around, you know, how can we get that alignment between MSIs and actors in the industry. In order for legislation to be effective, brands are going to need to have practical advice and guidance with examples of good practice. That's the role of the learning and implementation community in itself, this 2-year initiative that we're running. So in order to facilitate this collaborative working and this creative solution finding, we haven't included accountability into the learning and implementation community itself, because we are trying to get, you know, the creative juices flowing, and we're trying to get this engagement. But we do believe that more approaches are needed to run in parallel with the learning and implementation community. And so that we sort of would like to support other initiatives within the industry, and we are definitely lobbying for legislation and exploring what those other options could be.
Thank you, Lisa. Sadly, we're at the moment, due to the agenda, running out of time, but there were a few more issues that were mentioned that I think we should be taking forward, and maybe some of you will also be in other of the other panels on purchasing practices, due diligence, or even here in person. And that were, for example, the platforms via which you can do subcontracting and via which you can deal with order peaks. It's also the topic of which incentives are there for the buying and purchasing departments to do anything but just getting the cheapest price. What incentives are there for staff on that end? That's to cover just like a few of the open things that people are still grappling with. Luckily, this week's forum is only getting started, but I feel like I already could see some clear takeaways from today's session. One is it really can't be a conversation that only happens at the sustainability department. You need to find that buy-in from the whole company, from leadership, from the buying company, and there also need to be incentives to back that up. The second one, of course, is supplier voices are absolutely key in moving forward. But that doesn't mean voices don't get raised just because you say their voices are important. Voices get raised if the environment surrounding that allows for that voice to be heard without a negative impact on the client relationship. But also when we're designing solutions, they need to be designed together. They need to be checked after the solution was put into effect. And on the upside, I think there are some solutions and some low-hanging fruit out there that can be made accessible to people through the learning and implementation communities, and that can be scaled. So I hope that the learning and implementation communities can be a contributing factor for that ecosystem that we hopefully get to see that contributes to better purchasing practices. On that note, I would also like to thank Fatima, Arnaud, Elisa, and Vanessa for joining us today, and also like to thank each of you in the audience. I saw we have quite a good sized group going here at the moment. I've really enjoyed this opportunity today to moderate, and I will also be very keen to join a few of the other sessions on purchasing practices. For example, right after this one, we have one session on contracts and human rights and environmental due diligence. That's also an integral part. What Elisa was mentioning, also the question of legislation is something that comes up at 12 o'clock on unfair trading practices, also today. At the same time, we also have a session by the Industry We Want, talking about tracking on wages and purchasing practices and greenhouse gas emissions. The Industry One has developed these dashboards that basically measure where we stand right now, and I feel like they give you a very good thermometer of where we should be heading. And then today at 4 p.m. Paris EU time, we have one more on commercial compliance, accelerating change and measuring progress. And I think there were also a few questions on the tools or the better buying instruments. So for those of you, I think that could be also an interesting session. So on that note, thank you also very, very much for joining. Once again, thank you to the panelists and the audience. It's been a pleasure to have you all here today. And I hope to see as many of you as possible in any of the other upcoming fora and meetings. Thank you so much.